The fall of the financial giant. What went wrong? For centuries, Britain stood at the center of global finance. London's skyline rising as a symbol of power, the pound sterling commanding confidence, and the city operating as the world's most influential banking hub. But giants do not fall overnight. Britain's decline was not a single moment, nor a single mistake. It was a slow, grinding erosion, decades in the making. The roots of the collapse stretch back to the late 20th century, when deindustrialization began hollowing out the real economy. Entire manufacturing towns, once the engines of Britain's wealth, were left behind as industries moved overseas. By the early 2000s, Britain depended heavily on financial services, relying on the City of London for nearly 10% of its GDP. It created an illusion of strength, but beneath the glittering towers, the foundation was dangerously thin. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis didn't just shake Britain. It exposed how deeply Britain had tied its fate to an over-leveraged banking system. Institutions like RBS, once the world's largest bank, collapsed under their own weight, requiring the biggest bailout in British history. Trust was shattered. Investment dried up. Growth slowed. But the real blow arrived later, Brexit. With one vote, Britain severed itself from the world's largest trading bloc. Foreign investment dropped sharply. Thousands of financial sector jobs quietly relocated to Frankfurt, Paris, and Dublin. The pound weakened, inflation climbed, and businesses faced new trade barriers. What once made Britain powerful, openness, stability, connectivity, was suddenly uncertain. Meanwhile, long-term structural problems intensified. Low productivity growth, stagnant wages for nearly 15 years, a shrinking middle class, public debt surpassing £2.7 trillion, chronic underinvestment in infrastructure and skills. The consequences are everywhere today. A nation once known for prosperity now faces soaring living costs, struggling households, and a financial sector no longer unmatched. Britain didn't just lose its financial power. It drifted away from it, step by step, year after year. Its fall is not a mystery. It is a warning. From empire wealth to economic weakness, the long unraveling. There was a time when Britain towered over the world, its ships dominating the seas, its currency anchoring global trade, its industries fueling the modern age. The empire's wealth built cities, financed wars, and shaped generations. But behind the glory was a hidden vulnerability. Britain was building a financial crown on an economic foundation that was slowly cracking. The fall did not begin with a crash. It began with neglect. By the 1970s, the same factories that once powered the Industrial Revolution had grown outdated. Productivity stagnated. Entire regions, northern England, Wales, Scotland, slipped into decline as industries collapsed or were shipped overseas. What replaced them was not equally strong. Britain shifted to a service-heavy, finance-dominant economy, creating dependence on the City of London while weakening the nation's real productive base. This imbalance widened across decades. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Britain's over-reliance on banking backfired. Major institutions had to be rescued with taxpayers' money. Growth slowed. Inequality widened. Real wages fell and never fully recovered. A country once built on industrial dominance was now fragile, its prosperity exposed as dangerously concentrated in one sector. Then came Brexit, a decision driven by frustration, identity, and decades of economic imbalance. The consequences were severe. Foreign investment fell sharply. Trade barriers returned. Skilled workers left. London lost its status as Europe's financial gateway. Britain became the only major advanced economy where business investment still remains below pre-2008 levels. Meanwhile, public debt soared past £2.7 trillion, infrastructure aged, and social mobility stalled. Families today feel the cost of this long unraveling. Rising living expenses, shrinking purchasing power, and declining opportunities have replaced the prosperity once taken for granted. The empire's wealth is gone. What remains is a nation struggling to redefine itself. Britain didn't lose its financial power suddenly. It bled it away year after year through choices, crises, and missed opportunities. The trade shock, how Brexit broke the foundation. For decades, Britain thrived on one quiet superpower: unrestricted access to the world's largest trading bloc. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was the backbone of British prosperity. Products moved freely. Services flowed effortlessly. Investors poured money into the UK because it was the perfect gateway into Europe. Then, with one historic vote, that foundation cracked. Brexit did not only redraw borders, it re-engineered the UK's economic engine. Overnight, British businesses faced trade friction not seen in nearly 50 years. Customs forms replaced seamless commerce. Delays replaced certainty. Small exporters, especially in manufacturing, agriculture, and fishing, were hit the hardest. Many simply could not survive the new cost structure. The shock was immediate and relentless. British trade volume stagnated while competitors surged. The UK became the only major economy where goods exports failed to recover to pre-2016 levels. Sectors once seen as national strengths, automotive, chemicals, aerospace, lost foreign investment, production lines, and entire supply chains to the EU. Even services, Britain's most powerful weapon, suffered as banks, insurers, and investment firms quietly moved operations to Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and Paris. The consequences reached ordinary people long before politicians admitted them. Prices rose. Choice shrank. Skilled workers left, widening labor shortages in hospitals, transport, construction, and agriculture. Businesses struggled with rising import costs, supply chain chaos, and falling competitiveness. The pound weakened, making everything from energy to food more expensive. But the deeper damage was psychological. Britain lost the one thing global investors value above all else: predictability. A nation known for stability had become unpredictable, fragmented, uncertain. Brexit didn't just alter trade rules. It broke the economic foundation that supported Britain for generations. And while nations can rebuild, the journey back is long, costly, and filled with consequences that will shape a generation. This was not just a trade shift. It was a trade shock, one that Europe moved past, but Britain still feels in every corner of its economy. The erosion of the middle class, stagnant wages, and rising costs. For generations, Britain's strength didn't come from its elites or its institutions. It came from its middle class. Millions of ordinary families who worked, saved, built homes, and kept the nation stable. They were the backbone of the economy, the promise of opportunity, the symbol of national pride. But over the last 2 decades, that backbone has slowly begun to crack. The erosion started quietly. After the 2008 financial crisis, wages fell in real terms and never truly recovered. Britain entered an unprecedented economic era, the longest period of wage stagnation since the Napoleonic Wars. While other nations bounced back, British workers saw pay packets that barely kept up with inflation. Productivity growth, normally the engine of rising wages, flatlined for nearly 15 years, suffocating upward mobility. At the same time, the cost of living exploded. Housing became the first crisis. In the 1990s, a typical home cost 3 times the average income. Today, it is 8 to 9 times, pricing an entire generation out of ownership. Rents soared as supply collapsed. Childcare became some of the most expensive in Europe. Energy bills spiked. Food prices rose at the fastest pace since the 1970s. Even basic stability became a luxury. Families who once lived comfortably now live cautiously, counting pennies, delaying dreams, cutting essentials. The middle class, once Britain's anchor, is shrinking. The consequences ripple across society. Fewer young people starve families. Businesses feel falling demand. Social mobility plummets. A country once defined by opportunity becomes defined by inequality. With fewer people able to spend, invest, or build wealth, the entire economic engine slows. This is not just hardship, it is transformation. The erosion of the middle class is not a statistic. It is a national unraveling, a quiet crisis reshaping Britain's identity, its economy, and its future. This is how a financial power begins to fade, not through collapse, but through the slow disappearance of the people who once carried it. The debt trap, when borrowing replaces real growth. For decades, Britain told itself a comforting story, that borrowing was a tool, a bridge, a temporary fix. But somewhere along the way, a lifeline became a habit, and a habit became a trap. Behind the speeches, behind the budgets, behind the political promises, a silent shift was happening. Britain's growth was no longer built on productivity, but on debt. The warning signs began appearing long before anyone paid attention. In the early 2000s, household borrowing surged as wages stagnated and living costs climbed. Families who once saved for the future now borrowed to survive the present. By the time the 2008 financial crisis arrived, Britain had one of the highest levels of household debt in the developed world. Then came government borrowing to rescue banks, fund public services, and stabilize the economy. The state stepped in with unprecedented spending. Public debt, once manageable, began climbing year after year. Today, Britain carries over £2.7 trillion in public debt, more than 100% of its GDP when adjusted for liabilities. And the interest alone is now costing more than the entire national education budget. But the deeper problem is not the number, it is the pattern. Instead of investing in productivity, infrastructure, or innovation, successive governments used borrowing to patch holes. Rising healthcare costs, aging infrastructure, declining tax revenue, and social welfare pressures caused by a struggling middle class. Borrowing didn't fuel growth, it replaced it. Meanwhile, businesses faced their own strain. With weak productivity and falling investment, many firms relied on cheap lending to stay afloat. When interest rates rose, the illusion shattered. Small businesses closed. Mortgages became unaffordable. Economic growth slowed to its weakest levels in decades. The debt trap is not just a financial crisis. It is a psychological one. A nation once confident in its economic engine now fears every interest hike, every budget announcement, every global shock. This is how financial power erodes, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, suffocating dependence on borrowed time and borrowed money. Britain's housing illusion, the asset that became a burden. For decades, Britain celebrated homeownership as its greatest achievement, a symbol of stability, success, and national pride. A house wasn't just a place to live. It was a ticket to the middle class, a shield against uncertainty, a promise that tomorrow would always be better than today. But beneath this optimism, something darker was growing. The very asset that once secured Britain's future slowly became the burden dragging it down. It began with a simple shift. Demand rose, supply didn't. As early as the 1990s, Britain was building fewer homes than its growing population needed. Instead of fixing the shortage, policymakers allowed property prices to rise unchecked. Cheap credit, lax regulations, foreign investment, and buy-to-let speculation poured fuel on the fire. By the 2010s, housing wasn't a necessity. It had become a financial battlefield. The consequences were staggering. The average home that once cost 3 times annual income now costs 8 to 9 times. In London, the ratio exceeds 12 times, locking out an entire generation. Rent climbed faster than wages for more than 20 consecutive years. Britain built far fewer new homes per capita than France, Germany, or the Netherlands. This created a dangerous illusion. Rising house prices looked like national wealth, but only on paper. Families felt richer, banks felt safer, and governments felt no urgency to act. But beneath the surface, productivity stalled, wages stagnated, and the economy became dangerously dependent on real estate values instead of real economic growth. And then the burden arrived. Young families can't buy. Renters can't save. Workers can't move to high-opportunity cities. Businesses struggle to attract talent. Entire regions suffer from housing-driven inequality. Even the financial system trembles, tied tightly to inflated property values. Britain's housing market didn't just fail, it reshaped the nation's destiny. The asset that once built prosperity has become the weight that now threatens to break it. The productivity crisis, the engine behind Britain's decline. Every powerful economy has a hidden engine, productivity. When it rises, nations grow richer. When it stalls, even the greatest powers begin to fade. And for Britain, this silent engine has been failing for more than a decade. It is the story few politicians want to tell, yet it is the story at the heart of Britain's decline. The warning signs appeared after the 2008 financial crash. While other countries slowly recovered, Britain's productivity, the amount each worker produces per hour, flatlined. Not for a year, not for a recession, but for 15 long, defining years. Economists now call it the worst productivity slowdown since the early 19th century, a crisis so deep it reshaped the nation's economic destiny. Why did it happen? The causes run wide and deep. Underinvestment in infrastructure, railways, roads, energy systems, and digital networks aged while other nations modernized. Weak business investment. Companies reduced innovation, automation, and research, leaving Britain behind global competitors. Skills shortages. Chronic gaps in technical training left industries struggling to find workers who could keep pace with new technologies. Regional inequality. Cities like London surged, while large parts of the North, Midlands, Wales, and Scotland stagnated. Post-Brexit frictions. New trade barriers increased costs and reduced competitiveness for exporters. The consequences were devastating. With productivity frozen, wages stagnated. Living standards failed to grow. Public services became harder to fund. The middle class shrank, inequality widened, and Britain slipped behind countries it once led. According to economic studies, if productivity had grown at pre-2008 trends, the average British worker would earn £10,000 more per year. That lost wealth is not an abstract number. It is families struggling, dreams delayed, futures compromised. Britain didn't just lose productivity. It lost momentum, confidence, and the very engine that once powered its financial strength. This is the crisis behind every other crisis, silent, invisible, and devastating. Generational fracture. A country losing its confidence. For centuries, Britain inspired confidence, a nation whose vision, stability, and financial prowess commanded global respect. But today, a quiet fracture runs through its generations, threatening not just wealth, but belief itself. The nation's greatest asset, its confidence, is eroding, and with it, the very foundation of its financial power. The seeds of this fracture were planted decades ago. Economic stagnation, rising inequality, and escalating living costs created two starkly different realities. One for older generations who built wealth through stable jobs, pensions, and rising property values, and another for younger Britons struggling to find opportunity, affordable housing, or financial security. According to the Resolution Foundation, millennials and Gen Z now face earning potential 20 to 25% lower than their parents of the same age, despite higher education levels. Brexit deepened the divide. Many young people viewed it as a vote against their future, while older voters defended the past. Thousands of highly skilled workers left, investment stalled, and London's financial dominance weakened. Families now face crushing debts, soaring rents, and the threat of unemployment. A stark contrast to the confidence once embodied in the British dream. The generational fracture is not just economic, it is psychological. A country once defined by resilience now feels uncertain, anxious, and divided. Entrepreneurship declines as risk feels too costly. Young professionals delay families and homeownership. Regional disparities widen, and political polarization grows, undermining policy stability. This loss of confidence ripples across the economy. Consumer spending slows, innovation falters, and Britain's global influence diminishes. The consequences are not measured only in pounds or jobs. They are measured in hope deferred, ambition curtailed, and a nation questioning its place in the world. Britain did not fall overnight. It fractured quietly but relentlessly. Generational by generational, confidence waned, and with it, the power that once made Britain a financial giant. Political paralysis, why leadership keeps avoiding real reform. Britain's decline was never inevitable. What turned warning signs into full-blown crises was not only economic misfortune, it was political paralysis. Decisions delayed, reforms avoided, bold actions sacrificed for short-term convenience. A nation once renowned for pragmatic governance became trapped in indecision, while opportunities for renewal slipped through its fingers. The patterns are unmistakable. Infrastructure remained outdated even as transport, energy, and digital networks fell behind global competitors. Productivity stagnated, yet successive governments chose temporary stimulus over structural reform. Housing shortages persisted for decades despite repeated commissions and promises. Public services strained under rising demand, yet chronic underfunding was tolerated rather than corrected. This paralysis is rooted in a complex mix of politics and human behavior. Leaders face electoral cycles, factional pressures, and public impatience. Policies requiring tough choices, tax reform, pension adjustments, industrial modernization, or redistribution of resources, are postponed, softened, or abandoned entirely. Britain has become a nation where incrementalism dominates while crises accumulate. Brexit magnified the problem. Political energy shifted to negotiations, internal party battles, and short-term survival, leaving long-term economic strategy in limbo. Key reforms to labor markets, supply chains, and financial regulations were delayed. By the time action is taken, the cost has multiplied, leaving ordinary citizens to pay for years of indecision with higher living costs, stagnating wages, and eroding trust. The consequences are visible everywhere: declining competitiveness, shrinking investment, and a middle class increasingly burdened by debt and uncertainty. Young generations face fewer opportunities and less upward mobility. Public confidence in institutions has collapsed, weakening both democracy and the economy. Britain's financial decline is not only a story of economic missteps, it is a story of leadership failing to act decisively. Political paralysis didn't merely slow reform. It allowed decline to become entrenched, leaving the nation stranded between past glory and an uncertain future. Britain's possible future: slow decline or a national reset. Britain stands at crossroads. After centuries of financial dominance, global influence, and industrial might, the nation now faces a stark choice: continue a slow, inexorable decline, or seize the opportunity for a bold national reset. The path chosen will define a generation, shaping whether Britain remains a global player or becomes a cautionary tale of missed potential. If the decline continues, the consequences are clear. Productivity may stagnate further, leaving wages frozen and public services underfunded. Housing crises, debt, and regional inequality could intensify. London's financial sector risks losing its remaining edge to Frankfurt, Paris, and New York, while foreign investment bypasses Britain for more stable, competitive economies. Generational divides deepen, trust in institutions erodes, and social mobility falters. In this scenario, Britain becomes a nation trapped in the shadows of its former glory, its identity defined by nostalgia rather than innovation. Yet there is another path: the national reset. By confronting long-standing structural problems, investing in infrastructure, modernizing industries, reforming education, addressing productivity gaps, and embracing global trade opportunities, Britain could reignite growth. Technology, green energy, and advanced manufacturing offer potential to rebuild wealth, while social reforms could restore trust and opportunity for younger generations. Strategic fiscal management and decisive political leadership could transform debt and borrowing into investment in the future, not a burden. The stakes are more than economic. Confidence, ambition, and global relevance are on the line. Every policy decision, every investment, every leadership choice now carries disproportionate weight. Britain's next decade could either cement its decline or write a new chapter, a story of resilience, reinvention, and restored influence. History has shown that Britain can endure upheaval, adapt, and thrive. The question now is whether it will rise again or quietly fade from the center stage it once commanded. The future is not predetermined, it is a choice.